for our first journal club of 2020. I have with me today Jason from the Strength Guys. He's actually the founder. But Jason, if you could give us a little bit of an intro about yourself and what you've been doing and what you do for coaching and things like that, that would be great.
Yeah, it's good to be here. I recently just finished my Bachelor's of Health and Physical Education degree from Mount Royal University here in Calgary. I have an extensive background in coaching drug-free athletes in first bodybuilding, powerlifting, and also strength and conditioning. And I've also taken a foray into sports science with the Calgary Flames NHL team this past offseason. I say my main goal and my main MO, if you will, is that performance through innovation, which is our company motto. And I'm constantly creating things and trying to find a way to enhance the training of the athletes who entrust TSG with their goals and with their health and also with their enjoyment of training. So the journal club that we have for you all today is on velocity-based training, which is an interesting topic that can fill a lot of those gaps in potentially when it comes to results, as we'll discuss, and also the intent and enjoyment of training as well, which is a component of VBT, which is rather important as well. So, Brandon, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, so to start, I'll give a kind of a brief summary for those of you who may have not read the study fully or may just need a little bit of a reminder on what they did. So this was a study on velocity-based training versus percentage-based training. So VBT and PBT, I will refer to them as velocity and percentage because those two words sound very similar. So the subjects or participants were trained with decent kind of bench, squat, and deadlift numbers. The bench was about 108 kilos, the squat was 140, and the deadlift was about 178. So those were baseline numbers before the study started. And when they compared between the groups at baseline, they were the same in strength and biometrics and all the demographics and stuff. So they were randomized to one of those two training groups for 6 weeks. The training program is actually on a table in the study, and we might look at that later. But it was twice a week training, pretty typical. If your back squat, your bench press, a strict overhead press, a deadlift. They also did some hip thrusts, some plyos, and some walking lunges. So not a whole lot of volume or work in general, considering that, on average, I would say people who are serious about lifting probably train at least 3 times a week, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, not counting their kind of sport practice or whatever else they're doing. So anyway, what they eventually found was using the same program, the velocity-based training group they stopped 20% short of their kind of prescribed velocity for that training day or that training set or rep or whatever. So that was the only difference. And they basically found that both groups increased in strength over time, which is good. So we call that a time effect in science. Sometimes you'll see a group by time effect. So that would be the time component. The group component would be velocity or percentage based. And so both groups improved about 8 or 9% in squat, bench, and deadlift. And then the velocity group actually improved more in bench, so they're at that 9%, whereas the percentage group, I think it was about 5%. So that indicated, and that was significant, so that indicated that for some reason, which we'll kind of get into, the velocity group did better on the bench press at the end of the study. They also measured counter movement jump, CMJ, which I've done in a couple studies and during strength conditioning, but I don't know that we'll discuss that too much. That's just not something I think either of us are super interested in, but that is very repeatable. It's been shown before that with velocity-based training, you can increase movement jump, so counter movement jump. So to kind of describe to you, if you're like me and just kind of found out about velocity-based training a couple years ago, maybe been following along a little bit, maybe you haven't used it or you have, it's basically a training system where you put a small device on the bar and it tracks your velocity, right? So there are a number of different ranges that can be prescribed for training, and they range from about 1.3-ish, 1.5 meters per second, which is very, very fast. Call that the starting strength range. And then at the other end, kind of your 1RM range would be less than 0.5 meters per second. And if you want to look at the paper, or you can actually just Google it or whatever, they have kind of within that different ranges for speed strength, strength and speed, accelerative strength, and different nomenclature there. So did you have anything, did I miss anything on the summary, Jason?
Yeah, I just think I wanted to reiterate with the velocity zones and the correlation to percentage of 1 rep maximum that if well, VBT is for many different usages. Okay, so if one is looking to develop the ability of speed, generally this is less than 20% of the 1 rep maximum. So basically, like you're looking at body weight or like wearing a lightweight vest for strong individuals. You're looking at greater than 1.3 meters per second in mean concentric velocity. And then for power, so the development of both force and the rate at which force can be developed, in between 0.75 and 1.3 meters per second, which can be anywhere between 20 and 60% of the 1 rep maximum for power training. And finally, for strength, as Brandon said, in some studies, they'll say, 0.5 and below. The GymAware handout, actually, when you buy that unit, they suggest that anything less than 0.75 meters per second. But really, that would be dependent on the training status of the individual, which we'll get into in a little bit.
Gotcha. No, I'm not muted. When I was reading this study, I've reviewed a couple of VBT papers, mostly validity papers comparing the different devices, but I had not read kind of the primary literature on all of this. It dates back, and it actually dates back really, really far to the Russians and some of their textbook style things. But more recently, in the past decade, we'll say, Brian Mann has kind of been one of the leaders in the field in this aspect. He's got a book, a textbook on velocity-based training. It's a great read. I recommend it if you are super interested in learning more about it. But the first study that really kind of caught my eye was from 2011. It was Randall et al. And all they did was they had some rugby players, I think they're rugby players, and they put them under 6 weeks of training, and they gave them feedback on velocity. So they didn't manipulate velocity at all. It was just, hey, your velocity is X, Y, or Z. And what they found was when they gave feedback on velocity, players did better. And from a practical sense, I think this kind of helps competition in training. So if you're in a strength conditioning field, maybe you have two players going right back and forth between each other's, and there's iPads up on the platform or whatever. So it kind of encourages you to compete throughout your training. So that could be harder training. Now, in this study, they did a really good job of kind of wrapping in all of the relevant literature, because I was looking through it and I was like, okay, did they miss anything? And they really didn't miss anything. And they went a little bit long in the discussion, kind of elaborating on every single study that is slightly relevant. But one of the ones they kind of hammered on at first, and they said, I have a quote up here somewhere. But they were basically dissing the Smith machine used in a different study. And so I was like, that's interesting. Let me pull that study and read it. And in that study, basically they trained with a maximum velocity or a half speed velocity. and they found that max velocity, or trying to get that velocity high, caused greater strength gains in bench press. Right. So um, again, I don't know that there's a couple papers that do max and half velocity. I don't know that that's super practical. I would call those studies more about proof of concept studies, whereas, hey, there's some benefit to doing maximal contractions. Um, and then the more relevant study, I think, is a couple years ago. I think it's Pareja Blanco. I think that's how you pronounce it. And they did a velocity loss stop. So they had the same program. One group stopped at 40% of velocity loss. One group stopped at 20% velocity loss. And what they found was, there weren't any strength differences between the groups, meaning that you could stop at either of those velocities. However, there was a lot more volume done by the group who stopped at 20% velocity loss, which makes sense. You could probably do more work because you're less tired. They did find kind of improvements in hypertrophy and things like that, which as a bodybuilder, I kind of care a little bit more about. But those are the two main studies that they leaned on, two or three main studies they leaned on in the discussion. So let's see, Jason, did you have any other studies or anything that you noticed that may be relevant to that aspect?
Well, I found in this study rather interesting that the percentage-based training group ended up doing significantly more volume than the velocity-based training group did. Yet the velocity-based training group, mainly on bench press and then also on counter movement jump, experienced better results in terms of percent change than the percentage-based training group did. And that could be a hypothesis for future research, in that using velocity stops in order to dictate how many reps athletes are doing at a given weight may be a better way of managing fatigue and also while accumulating volume of training and practice, which may lead to superior results. We've seen in studies where obviously more volume to what end is not better. And that's been shown in German volume training studies and what have you. So we know there's somewhat of a dose response relationship that exists for each individual that as of right now is indeterminable with our current scientific methods. It would be awesome if we could determine this, but the current methods out there of like MEV and MRV, like they're so theoretical that it's a nice idea, but it's not hashed out mathematically. And I don't know if we will ever be able to hash something out like that mathematically, just because of how much plays into performance, which is really the biological aspect of training. So I found that interesting that the velocity-based training group had better results. And I also think that we should begin the discussion about velocity-based training use in strength and conditioning versus in powerlifting, because, or more broadly for strength training. Because what velocity-based training involves is measuring the average concentric velocity, so the lifting phase of a movement. And that's called the mean concentric velocity in this study. But in any exercise which isn't a power exercise, there is an inherent component near the end of the range of motion where athletes are breaking with that load because they have to decelerate it, right? Like you can't just infinitely accelerate through a bench press. And if
throw the bar
that,
up.
yeah, well, that's exactly it, right? As compared to a bench press throw. So for powerlifting, the application of velocity-based training is one that has greatly interested me. We have a few athletes who are using it. including the best lifter in the world, Taylor Atwood. Um, and we found some really interesting things over the past few years that aren't documented in the research, and that have actually made it difficult to implement velocity-based training with these high-level athletes. And I'd like to cover some of the difficulties that I've experienced in implementing VBT with high-level athletes. And the first one is that we follow a percentage-based training approach to prescription. And we use the APRE method in order to determine what the 1 rep maximum of a lifter is. We don't use the APRE method every week because we found that doing rep max testing every week was just not managing fatigue effectively, and eventually the training cycle would just crash. So we're more strategic at when we do an assessment. And compared to the values that the APRE method and using our coach's eye leads us to for 1 rep maximum, which are the values that we prescribe training off of, I have never seen in training any of the prediction equations used in the open barbell or speed for lifts encoder applications predict within 10 kilos what the athlete actually ends up doing on competition day. And so right then and there, that rules out one possibility for us of training with VBT in basically having the athlete complete a VBT profile to start the day, and then taking their estimated 1 rep maximum based off of the velocity-based training profile and calculating their working weights for that, because it's volatile and it's been all over the place. So that's the first difficulty that I've noticed. The second difficulty that I've noticed is how consistent elite level powerlifters are at low velocities, to the point where there is almost no regression. I've had no regression occur in a former European record holder in the squat with a maximum of 282.5 kilos on the squat in the 83 kilo division, where we simply could not get any sort of regression from 80% to 90% and beyond, because URA was so consistent. And another interesting observation is that the slowest, which Taylor Atwood, who, if you watch him on the platform, he's actually quite an explosive lifter when you watch his squats, former professional football player, played running back. He was a very powerful and very fast athlete during his playing days. Actually has a slower minimum velocity threshold with his 1 rep maximum than anything documented in the research. The lowest value I found on squat was in a Helms 2016 study, which suggested that the minimum velocity threshold of 1 rep maximum attempts was 0.24 meters per second, and Taylor is 0.14 meters per second, which is quite slow. So I just think there's some things that need to be discussed with applying this to higher level strength athletes, and potentially when VBT should be applied versus when it shouldn't.
Yeah, no, that was really good. So, you know, our hope in Journal Club is to not only kind of analyze the science, but translate it into something of application. And so that was some really good examples. You know, when we look at these studies, it's really hard to apply them to ourselves, as you mentioned, because of A, response heterogeneity, but B, a lot of these studies are on relatively trained people, or people who like may be strong and may have training experience, but they're not athletes who have been training a certain way, or maybe even had a coach. You know, a lot of these guys and gals might be training themselves, and it's a whole different ballgame when you get into the upper levels. So again, that was really good. I think just to get back to the study for a second, and then we'll go back practical again. of this study, there's a number of different strengths and kind of limitations that we go over, and they mentioned a number in the discussion. But I think one thing that really concerned me was the lack of data on the actual velocity of these lifts, right? So it wasn't, at least I didn't see it. Like if it's in there, I might be blind. There wasn't anywhere in the data where it said, the velocity group actually was within their range. So that's usually in a paper like this, just as a proof of concept. The other thing was it's kind of a shorter protocol, 6 weeks. It's an exercise science study, so that's totally okay. Small study pool. They lost a lot of people in the first little bit. It looks like I think they started with 11 and got down to 8. Um, the opposite side of that, though, one of the strengths that I rarely see is the adherence level they had. So adherence is just how much do you show up and how well do you stick to the protocol. And they had 100% there. So that's, translation is really high to this population if you fall within that. So that was really cool to see. They didn't have any dietary stuff, but I don't know that in this population the diet really changes much, or it would make a huge difference just because they weren't training very much in general. Um, I don't remember the average age, but one thing that I thought was a little bit odd.
18 to 30, I recall. So
They were what? Sorry.
it was 18 to 30, if I recall
Yeah, so
correctly.
so probably like college age participants. Sounds like. But one thing I did pick up in the methods, and I kind of highlighted it and underlined it, was the concentric to eccentric protocol that they used. So obviously, concentric as fast as you can for both groups. They told them to do that. But the eccentric was a 3-second eccentric, which I'm just thinking for a deadlift and a squat and bench, maybe, competition bench, you go a little slower. But I don't know that that's the best method. And I don't know that I would do that when most studies use a 2-2 or a 2 or a 1-1 or something less strenuous. So that does make the training a little bit harder. Um, and they even say a minimal pause, but that probably means no pause. So just that kind of blankets the strength and limitation side of things. I do think overall this was a much better study than a lot of the VBT studies, and I enjoyed reading it a lot. So did I miss anything? You have any other limitations or strengths before we get back to the practical application side?
Yeah, just from my end as a coach, it would have been nice to see how the velocity-based training group adhered to the program. So how many reps they ended up doing uh, with their 20% velocity stop in comparison to the percentage-based training group, and how they ended up performing less volume but getting better results.
Mm-hmm.
With was there one or two massive sets, and then just the third set was a complete drop off? Like we don't really know much about what actually happened in that protocol, and that would be interesting to see as a coach, especially because VBT is so it's so new compared to the traditions of percentage-based training. And if we want to start appealing to people to begin writing their programs using auto-regulation methods, we have to start teaching them and being transparent with what this looks like.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because when you calculate even volume, right, you could just plot it over the weeks, and they have this data. They definitely have this data, and you could see like reps, like you said, but just total volume. Is there a point where magically during week 4 they started doing a lot less, maybe because of the I still find it really hard to believe these people were super fatigued, but maybe they were. And maybe that's where the tipping point is. Is it's not week 1 and 2 and 3 don't matter so much, but week 4, 5, and 6, it's like, oh, well, maybe from our perspective as a coach, that's deload area, right? That's kind of taking a break and dissipating that fatigue anyway. So I don't know that we would go that long of a block. but maybe we would for certain people. So that's actually a really good point. I didn't think about that. Okay. So did you have anything else that I missed?
Not with regards to the particular study that we've been discussing, but I did prepare a open access, completely free resource for the people who are viewing and for the people who are members of our exercise and nutrition journal club. So I'm going to share my screen here and actually give a demo of calculating velocity and um, prescribing velocity-based training with it.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll let you take it away from here, and I'm gonna mute myself so I can stay quiet.
Oh, uh, having some difficulties sharing my screen here. Let me know if it pops up.
There you go. You're good.
I just updated my Mac to Catalina. I was super behind on that, so just had to go into system preferences to allow it. So I created this velocity-based training journal club workbook. It'll tell you what to do in each step, but I'll walk you through it. So this is actually the warm-up protocol which we follow in powerlifting competitions and in training. The only thing that we wouldn't do in training is we wouldn't do a 90% set. Generally, the highest we'd go is 85% and then get to your workout. So we like this protocol because it's not just plating it, where as you get closer and closer to your 1 rep maximum, you're actually jumping from like 70 to 80% or 70 to 85%, because that's going to feel awful when you put that on your back. And it's also graded in decreasing increments. So you're never going to be making a bigger jump in weight than you did previously. So we're doing 15% jump, 15% jump, 10% jumps, and then we're going to 5% jumps as we work closer up to 90%. This has been really good for us in competition and just with giving our athletes some practice before they start their work sets. And we also modify it for velocity profiling. So when we profile an athlete using a velocity-based training unit, we will have them move 1 rep at 60%, 70%, 80%, 85%, and 90% of their 1 rep maximum as fast as they possibly can. And they're to record the load that they did and the mean concentric velocity of that 1 rep, which they moved as fast as possible. For best results, you'd want to do a test retest of this. So you would go in, you complete the 60 to 90% VBT profiling protocol, rest for 48 to 72 hours, do it again, and then you calculate out the average mean concentric velocity of your 2 trials, and then move forward with that. And once you've filled this out, you'll see that it will populate with an R value. The closer you are to -1 in correlation, the better of a correlation you have between percent 1RM and mean concentric velocity. And then you'll see the MVT cell. So MVT stands for minimum velocity threshold. And this is the slowest that you can move a weight successfully through the concentric phase of a rep. So in a study by Helms et al. In 2016, they suggested that the minimum velocity threshold for their participants on the back squat was 0.24, and on the bench press, 0.1. But I'm going to go with Taylor Atwood's minimum velocity threshold, which is 0.14. So when you enter in the slowest that, in this case, Taylor Atwood can move a weight through the concentric phase before he fails, you could then get a calculation, roughly, of what your estimated 1 rep maximum is. And this entire section was put in the applications of velocity-based training in the Australian Strength and Conditioning Association Journal by Mladen Jovanovic and Eamon Flanagan in 2014. So that's where I retrieved this. So moving on, once you've entered in your profiling information, now it's time to start writing your program. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to adjust for just some error in first rep velocity from our target velocity. So I would never say to an athlete that I want you to squat a weight that on your first rep is exactly 0.21, because that's very impractical. So instead, I might say you could be 0.05 meters per second over or under 0.21. And then I'll say I want you to stop when the velocity of a rep has decreased by 40% from the first rep, or the fastest rep of the set. So we could set our velocity stop parameters here. And then if you go to prescribe the program, let's say that we want to do 3 sets of 5 at 80% of the 1 rep maximum. The spreadsheet will calculate the target velocity for 80% of the 1 rep maximum. And then it will propose a velocity range, which the first rep of the set should fall within. And that's based off of our custom entries here for the upper and lower boundaries that we decide upon. So what we do is we recommend that if the first rep of a set is below our velocity range, the lifter should adjust the weight down by 2.5 or 5% for the next set. And if it is above the velocity range, the lifter can adjust the weight up by 2.5 or 5% for the next set. Now, if you want to use velocity stop programming, what we could do is we could clear out the reps here, and we could say you're going to lift 80% of your 1 rep maximum until a rep is 0.28 or slower, and then you're going to terminate the set. So if you're having a great day, you may be able to do 6, 8, maybe even 10 reps if you haven't assessed in a while. Whereas if you're having a poor day, you may be cutting the set after 2 or 3 reps, right? So this is the auto-regulatory approach to prescribing training. And this is the velocity stop method. So to give you an idea of what the study did, they had a 20% velocity stop. So if our first rep was a target velocity of 0.46, the lifter would have to terminate their set at 0.37. So what was interesting about this when I was reading the study is, again, I wanted to know how they made up the volume that they did. And I'm also curious in terms of future questions I have about the link of velocity stop and RPE. Mm-hmm. And also, as a bigger question, whether or not strength athletes should just use RPE instead of velocity. So what are your thoughts on that, Brandon?
Yeah, so I think, so I've seen some of this in action in the strength and conditioning rooms, like I mentioned earlier, with iPads and things up on squat racks. Usually it's for squats. And I think for sport athletes, it's probably pretty beneficial, at least as a way of training. I don't know that it's any better. Actually, it seems to be slightly better for some, but still maybe not worth the trouble of, the equipment, the programming, the upkeep, whatever the software costs and things like that, trusting people's algorithms. So for sport athletes, I think it could be useful, but I probably wouldn't use it. I like simple things. For kind of power athletes, I have not used it and probably won't. At this point, if there's something comes out that we figure out one lift is really, really beneficial to use it on, say this bench press percentage increase holds across 3 or 4 studies and you have really well-trained people, well then, 5% extra may be worth, me programming it for the upper athletes. Um, and then in terms of like the bodybuilders, of course, got to include them. There's no, I would definitely not use this. It's just too much for their purposes.
Yeah, I think if I were looking to run a cost-effective weight room for the majority of athletes, I would recommend using RPE. Um, in very specific cases where elite athletes are training, and we perhaps would like a minimally invasive way of assessing their strength,
Mm-hmm.
I would recommend velocity-based training, because when you compare getting a rough estimate of your 1 rep maximum by following a standardized warm-up protocol of velocity-based training to the amount of muscle damage and fatigue which will come from doing a 1 rep maximum or from doing a rep maximum, it's clear that monitoring via estimated 1RM from velocity-based training is a very favorable approach. And we've used that for 3 of our world-class lifters instead of the rep max approach that we use with APRE. So it's kind of a very pick and choose and where velocity-based training can solve problems for strength athletes. And I think that the main benefit to velocity-based training in comparison to just relying on RPE in order to regulate how many reps you're doing in a set is that velocity-based training won't lie to you about the intent of how fast you're moving a weight. And so for athletes who have struggled with bar speed, or for extreme examples, maybe their third attempt in competition moves faster than their opener, we began to integrate VBT into their program, because we're like, we can't, as coaches, the coach in powerlifting is literally looking for a regression in bar speed. Like, that's visually what we're looking for. And we're trying to determine how much more you can do. And if there's actually a progression in bar speed as we're adding weight, it's very, very difficult to predict what the actual 1 rep maximum strength is. So we've used that as a tool to help train our athletes better and start to develop a more normalized response between load and velocity.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I was imagining coaches on laptops in between, sets at nationals or whatnot, trying to calculate, okay, well, what if we added that? And then, okay, so you should attempt this next. I'm just thinking, man, that would be a mess. So yeah, I think when you get into the upper ranges, I don't know if we're there yet, but it's pretty novel. And I mean, from a scientific perspective, well-designed studies are important. Asking questions like this is like, so is this can we train a different way and get good or as good or better results in just different manners? Because we know we have people who want to train differently, and maybe you have an athlete who is kind of in that intermediate range who wants to they're just like, coach, I just want something different. Can you give me something different? And you're like, well, yeah, sure, I can do that. And so this is something that you could lean back on if you needed to. Okay, so I think that's pretty much the discussion, unless you had any closing comments, Jason.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the one thing which velocity-based training may not take into consideration that RP does is really the cognition of it. Like, let's say that I'm a participant in this study and I'm doing back squat, and I came up from the bottom position on 1 rep, and my weight just got in front of me and it was slow. But it was just early in the set and it was a silly technical mistake. and now I've capped my set because I'm velocity stop 20%. I've I have to terminate it according to the study guidelines, but I actually have a lot more to give on that set, and it was just a silly mistake. So this doesn't account for technical mistakes. I also think that limb length and lifting style needs to be taken into consideration when employing velocity-based training as well. Um, and just as a note on how we are applying it, the demonstration I showed with the spreadsheet, where I was referring to if someone is below the first rep of the velocity zone, they could decrease weight for the next set, or if they're above it, they can increase weight. We are using that concept in our new athlete management system at the Strength Guys, but we may actually end up going with a RPE concept for adjusting weight in reference to the last rep of the set, rather than using velocity stops. So we may be looking at combining both velocity and RPE in conjunction with percentage-based training moving forward.
Yeah, that's actually we were discussing that a little bit before the chat, but that would be kind of integrating multiple approaches is, I think, the next step, even in research too. So I'm interested if anybody's working on that. I haven't heard anything though. So, okay. Well, we will end there. Jason, if you want to give us a little information on where we can find you and, on the internet and stuff. So if people want to get to you, they can.
Yeah, you could follow us at the Strength Guys, and if any researchers are interested in having a glance at this training data when we're applying velocity-based training and RP-based training and percentage-based training in a multimodal approach, we have a very organized and extensively documented history of our lifters. So just get in touch with me. If you have any questions, my email is jason@thestrengthguys.com. My Instagram is JasonTSG.
Nice. Well, thanks for joining us. And